So today we are going to be looking at forms. If you were curious, we're going to look at just some different things that we can do with them, um, and just some real basic stuff. Now, there is just if you are not aware or remembering, the book that I gave everyone access to in Google Docs it has a lot of this information in here. I've already started working on creating that. Um, so if it's not in the notes online, it is in the book there, so you can take a look online and go through that. And that's got a lot more detailed information than a lot of times I put in the notes. So just looking at that. So with a form, this is something that we probably all have seen at some point on the internet. You've had to fill out something, and they can be really, really simple. A form can be as simple as like one text box that's used as a search form. You type something in and you hit the enter key and it goes off and searches. That takes a little bit of JavaScript in order to know that, hey, you click the enter key and now we're going to go search. Usually you're going to have at least one form field and then a button that's like a submit button. Now, that submit button might have a label of search, or it might have a label of continue to next step, or it might have whatever, but that label, so that button is what submits the form, makes it process and go and do things. Sometimes a form looks real obvious like that. Sometimes it's somewhat hidden. If you've ever uploaded a file to YouTube, for example, there's some hidden fields in there, but it's still working even though you don't necessarily see it. And that's where CSS comes into place, is that you can style these forms to look as similar or as different to your website and other forms as you want within some reasonable limitations. We looked at tables last week, and we saw how some table fields did not really work real well with CSS, and some of the CSS properties that we're used to setting didn't work. That there is some of that with forms, but not nearly as bad. So, and usually there's still a way to work around it if you're trying. There are some libraries that help us with that, and sometimes they'll do a little bit of JavaScript behind the scenes for us. That's kind of up to them. But we're going to just look at some basic form information, how we can work with it to make it more usable. So the first thing we need to do is I'm going to share my screen so you can see this as we're going to build it out. Is we would need to have a form tag. And there are some default properties that come with this form tag. Now, you may not see this, you may not be fully aware of them and whatnot, but they are there. Now, with that in mind, there are default values for these properties. So if you don't put them in, the form will still work. It may not work like you want, but it will work. And everything that we're going to do within our form is going to be within this opening and closing form tag. Now, a lot of times I will only have a single form on my web page like this, but I may have additional ones. It's not a rule. It's kind of like a guideline. So I may have, like, every page has a search form, and then if you need to contact us, there's another contact form. And so what the browser does is it looks at what form was there and what form was clicked on, and anything that was clicked on gets submitted to what they call a form processor. Now, if we do not define that form processor, it's the same page that we're currently on. That's not real helpful to us, right? I got to need to send it to another place. So what I can do is inside my form tag, I can set one of my properties, and I can call it the action property. And this action property says, where am I going to send this to? So I can send it to, oops, whole nother file. It doesn't even have to be on the same domain that I'm on. Now, typically, I'm going to send it to the same domain. That's normal. I'm not usually sending this to other people. I want to send it to me. My company needs to process it. But in general, I can do something like this. The action is, where is this form going to go? What is it going to do? The next property I'm going to look at usually is going to be the method. And the method is going to be either get or post. 99 times out of 100, you're doing one of those two. So let's talk about what these two methods are, how they differ. So get is anytime I do a web search in Google or in Bing or something like that. A lot of times you'll see, Google.com, and then it'll be something with a question mark, and then it has a whole bunch of stuff. Those are the form fields and values that got sent to Google. And that's what happens in get. Get says it's going to put any of our information inside of what they call the URL string. The URL string is just going to be where it goes. And my web address, if we remember back from when we talked about URLs and what makes them up a little while ago, we said it goes up to a page dot, and then the file extension, and then we might have a question mark, and the rest is that request string. And that's all set by the get method. And it can be very simple, or it can be pretty complicated. It's up to what the web page is doing. Now, get's going to have some limitations because of that. It's a little bit faster, but the limitations are twofold. One is a physical limitation. Your URL strings cannot be more than about approximately 4,000 characters. I believe it's 4,096 if you want to be specific. We'll call it 4,000 just to be safe. So 4,000 characters is a maximum limitation. Now, that includes the web host, the subdomain, any folders, the file name, as well as all the information that gets pushed in. Now, that's about 2 type pages. So that's quite a bit, but that gets used up very quickly with certain types of fields. And remember, you got to have everything as a name value pair. So it's not just what the user types, it's also what was called. So that actually can be hit without a lot of difficulties before you realize it. Now, the second type of method, and one that's also used most commonly, is post. And post is a little bit different in that you're not going to see inside a URL string. It gets sent with what they call the HTTP headers. So basically, anytime that you go and request a file from a web server, you make an HTTP request. And there's some information that's sent in this data packet that you don't see. It includes what the domain request is, what the file name is, any cookies that are associated with that file from that browser, and form information. And our post can be as big as it needs to be. So we don't have that 4,000 byte limit. What happens is if the header packet request gets too big, it splits up into a couple of requests, and it knows how to piece it together on the back end. Nothing that we have to do to worry about it. So if I need to upload, let's say, a file to YouTube, this is how it's done. It's done through a form using post. If I need to submit a password, I'm going to want to use post because that's hidden from my standard site. I can't have someone looking over my shoulder and go, oh, and see what my password is by looking inside the URL. There's actually a term for that. It's called shoulder surfing. It's a security term. Anything that you want to be private, you want to make sure you use the method of post. So this is going to include things like if they're sending a job application, their social security number is going to be visible, or if they're purchasing something and their credit card's visible, or they're logging in and their password is going to be visible, or any of those types of things you want to make sure is going to be hidden. Typically, this might refer to as what they call PII, personally identifiable information. And if you deal with security at all in computers, you'll hear that term be thrown around all the time. And it's just, how can I identify you? Because I don't want to have identifiable information just be out there. I want it to be hidden. I want it to be protected because I don't want someone to go around, steal that information, steal your identity, and try to open up a credit card as yourself or a loan application or anything else. So some common things that you might see that's personally identifiable information could be as simple as a phone number. A lot of times phone numbers are tied to an individual, especially nowadays with everyone having cell phones instead of a shared family line that you would, mount the phone up on the wall and everyone would kind of share it. So a phone line, an address is partially PII, a student number, employee number, social security number, I-9 number, any of those type of things would be all considered PII. Um, Even things like birthdays and names could be considered PII. You got to be really careful with that type of stuff. So when in doubt, use the post method. Okay. The third one is something called URL encoding. And the encoding is just a process of how do we submit the data. There's a type that's encoded for web components. That's typical. There's a plain text encoding that just sends stuff as plain text. And there's a multi-part form. Now, luckily, our browsers are smart enough to convert it if we need to. The multi-part form is where we're going to send a lot of data, and that's going to be most commonly done if we're going to upload a file. So even if we set the wrong type, a lot of times the browser goes, oh, wait, I know what you really mean, and will save it for us and switch it out. But it's best to always have it right, of course. So remember, we talked about how our browsers will tend to fix things if they see it needs to be fixed, but we don't want to rely on that if we can avoid it. Okay, so that's just the form tag. And all that does is says, let me gather up all this information and send it someplace. That's all it's doing. Now, our action can send it to an email address. If we say mail to : and an address, that is not very wise, just as a kind of FYI. Because a lot of people don't have a desktop mail client anymore. It could be because you're on a shared machine, like a computer lab at work, or maybe you always use Gmail. And so if you get some mail to request, you don't have a email application on your computer anymore. You're using Gmail or using Hotmail or using something else like that. So while it's possible to use it, it's not really recommended. Okay, so let's start talking about what we're going to be able to do with our different types of form fields. And our form fields can be a little complex and a little simple at the same time. So I'm going to show you two to start off with. The first is going to be a label. And I'm going to specify 4 first name. If I could type today. Okay, so 4 first name. A label is going to do a couple things. I'm going to just display this real quick. Okay, here's my first example, and here's first name. Notice that it's saying there, no big deal. Right now it's not doing much because the label just is used to describe the text box that's next to it. Or at least it's usually next to it. So by default, it looks like plain text. You say, well, why can't I just use a paragraph or something like that? Well, a label has a special for attribute. And if you notice it right here, this for attribute helps to describe and tell what form field it's describing. So I'll come in here and say input ID equals first name. And now, because the ID is the same as the for value inside of my label, these two are connected. Now, it's really simple. If I click inside of my label, it goes and puts my mouse cursor inside of my text box that's associated with it. That's nice. When I start doing more things like radio buttons, which if you ever look at a radio button like really, really small, or a checkbox, they're really small, and especially if I'm like on my mobile phone, clicking on it might be a real challenge. And so I can click on the label and it will check that radio button, or it'll check that checkbox for me. So that's really advantageous for me. In a text box like this, it's just going to put my mouse cursor inside of it. It also has a big advantage with using a label, is that if I am let's say I'm visually impaired, I have a hard time seeing, and I need to use a screen reader. And a screen reader is just going to audibly display to tell me what the screen is saying. Well, they should be able to read the label, identify the for attribute with the text box, and help the end user know what they're going to supposed to enter into their text box. Now, it can't force it, but it's supposed to help. So let's look a little bit more at this input, just so we can kind of get some more information. We have the ID, and that links to our for. This is also useful for if we're doing any JavaScript work. So if we need to do some form validation, or if we need to do some other type of work, have an ID is very beneficial. Unfortunately, when I submit my form, the ID is ignored. It uses another property called name. So usually my name and my ID are going to be either the same or similar. They don't have to be, though. So I'm using F name here to be short for first name, and that's totally acceptable. When I save this, if I reload my browser, you'll notice there's nothing different that you see in there. It is strictly something behind the scenes for when we gather up all of our form information and send it out. That's all that name is being used for. I can also apply classes to this, always helpful. I can specify, and this one is pretty important, the type property. Now, by default, my type is text, but I can make other things. We'll show you that in a minute. And then I also have value. Value is going to be what's going to be displayed inside my text box. Now, that's really nice and helpful for a case like this, or if I want to preload it. So let's say I had a form and I was updating some records at work, and so I pull up, a product, and it has the product name, and it has the product ID, and it has the retail price, and all this type of stuff. Well, I could fill out all that information, and then only if they want to change it do they change it. So the diff value has some benefits for us. I also have something that's very similar called placeholder, but it's a little bit different. So I'm going to put in, just enter your first name here, and I'm going to reload this. And you'll notice that in a little bit lighter gray, you may not be able to tell, through the screen sharing stuff, but in a little bit lighter gray, you're going to see the placeholder. Now, if I put a value in there and I submit my form, that value is sent. The placeholder text is not. Because if I come in here to type, as soon as I start typing, my placeholder text goes away. If I put in a value, the value overwrites the placeholder text, and it doesn't necessarily make it go away. I can append it, I can do anything else. If I delete it, I see the placeholder. So value is sent to the server. Value will display over placeholder, but value can be deleted and you'll see placeholder. All up to you. All right, let's look at the next thing. Oops. Here I'm going to specify both the name and ID as age. So just because you start one way and they don't match up doesn't mean they don't want to match up the rest of them. I'm going to specify this type as a number. Okay. Notice when I move over it, I'm just hovering. I haven't clicked inside this. Notice on my far right-hand side, I see a couple of arrows. Okay. So I can come over here and I can go up and down and use this like a little spinner to control what the value is. I can type a number like 35. But if I try to type in letters, type in 35 by the name of the number, nothing works. Only if I type in numbers. So numbers is, while text was available in previous versions, forms have been available since I think about HTML2. Text boxes were started off with that. Numbers is a much more recent addition. And there's a lot of recent additions. Calendars for dates and times, numbers, ranges, all types of stuff. Excuse me. So number is a perfect example of something that kind of comes into place with that. I can even set a min and max value if I want, and do some real simple things like that. So it becomes really helpful as far as that goes. Oops, there we go. All right, so that's a number. And like I said, there's a lot of different ones that are available to you. If you look inside the online book, you can find out as far as other things that you can do, values you can put in there. We're going to look at some of the basic ones, but not all of them by any stretch of the imagination. The one I want to do is I put a line break here, so go to new line, and I want to show you a checkbox. So checkbox is another input type. So I'm going to specify label for, this is going to be for registered. Input type equals checkbox. ID equals registered. Okay. And notice if I click on the label or the box, it's checked. Now, the way that we can control a check by default is there is a property and it only has to be defined. So here I specified checked. And I can uncheck it, but by default it's checked. So if I come here and reload, because I specified checked, it shows up as checked. Notice that checked here, I don't have to say checked equals checked or checked equals true or anything like that. If I say disabled, notice it's checked, but I cannot change it. It's a little bit grayed out. I don't know if you guys can see that through the screen sharing or not, but it is disabled, which means that you cannot make that change. Now you can control that with JavaScript and re-enable it. So if some condition is met, and we're going to talk about JavaScript, which is a client-side programming language. We'll talk about some others later on too, but for right now, we're just looking at this. Now, a lot of times your checkboxes will come before your label, and that's easy enough to fix, like that. Okay, so there's a lot of quick things that you can do to kind of work with that. A checkbox is sometimes known as a unary tag. That unary means singular or one. It stands by itself. Some people will call it a Boolean input because it's either checked or not checked. What's interesting about this is if it is checked, the value is sent. If it is unchecked, no value for it is sent. And that's how it knows. I've actually used this, excuse me, to my advantage when I was building some web forms. I had a really big web form, about 150 questions, and it had a lot of these checkboxes in there, like, do you need this feature, do you need that feature, etc. And so I created checkboxes, and the name would be like, do you need headlamps? Check. And it'd be, yes, I do, would be the value. So the value isn't here, so there's nothing still to be sent. So I want to set a value. That way, if it was checked, I would get that information. Now, the next one I'm going to look at real simple is going to be a radio button. And a lot of times radio buttons, once again, can start off with the left. Radio R1. You'll see why I'm going to do that first in a second. Name is favorite. I have value equal red. Now, if I reload this, all I'm going to see is my radio button. Okay, gotta have the label to go with it. Real important, especially with the checkbox and the radio button. Placeholder text doesn't work real well. There's not enough place to show it, so I need to have my label. I was going to duplicate these real quick. Now, notice that I changed my IDs. That's because my IDs all need to match up with the for attribute. But my name did not change. And that's an important thing. So the way that a radio button works is we actually create them in groups. And so here's red, green, and blue. Well, I don't know if this is really a group or not. So I look at the name property, and everything has a name property with a radio button only allows one to be selected. Notice if I click on red, it's selected, but blue is now unselected. Green is selected now red isn't. I can only select one at a time. It doesn't matter if I click on the radio button itself or the label that goes associated with it. It's only letting me choose one item at a time. That's a real important factor with the radio button. Typically, if I have just a couple of options, I'll use a radio button. If I have lots of options, let's say I had 50 or 70 or 100 options or more, I'll use a drop-down menu. We'll look at that later. But for right now, I just want to show you the radio button. Okay, so radio buttons are used when we have a choice between a small group, usually 5 or less. Our radio buttons are usually only the labels will only be a word or two. We don't want to have like really big, long worded things if we can avoid it. Now, sometimes that's what's needed. But a lot of times we want to think simple. And the reason why is a lot of times we're going to put them out either like on a horizontal row like this, or we might put them in a vertical stack. That's kind of up to us and how we style and lay things out. Excuse me. Okay. Excuse me. All right. So far we've looked at inputs as a text box, a single line text box, as a single line box that allows us to put a number in it, for a checkbox, and for radio buttons. And we've used the label associated with them. What else could they be used for? Well, actually quite a bit. The input tag is used for probably about 80 to 90% of all the tags available on a web page form. So we've mentioned some things like ranges and calendars and date time fields and stuff like that. Um, it can also be used if my type is an image. It can be used as an image that can be clickable inside of a form. It can be hidden, and hidden can be used to define some hidden information that you don't want to see. So, for example, let's say maybe you're filling out a long form and it goes page 1. Click here to continue to page 2. You fill all stuff. Well, how does it know that page 1 stuff was submitted? Well, it sent it over into your form and had it as hidden fields. Maybe a hidden field is being used as keeping track of who's logged in and different things like that. So hidden fields have a lot of uses. A lot of times you don't see them with a label because it's hidden. The screen reader shouldn't display it, just like you don't see it on the screen with your eyes. Um, there's three different types of buttons you can have. You have a generic button, but you can also have a reset, which clears all your form values back to default, or you can have a submit type, which becomes a submit button for you that sends our data to our server. So the input winds up being used for a lot of different options. Now, a lot of cases I've been seeing that we have forms that they're using as the inline text field, even though it should really be something else. It's not wrong, but it's not right either. You really want to use the appropriate type. So numbers, if you're looking at numeric data, there's an email address one, etc. Okay. Now, regardless of which type I pick, I'm stuck to a single line or maybe a little bit less. So if I want to have a multi-line, I'm going to use what's known as a text area. So I just have a please enter your comments. And typically, not always, but typically, a text area is going to be on a different line than our label. Text area is going to have an open and closing tag. It has both. What's cool about this is it can be multiple lines. Notice that these cannot. Text area can be multiple lines. In fact, it can start off with multiple lines. So we can do something like, I think it's size. Nope. Not size. Width. Nope. Oh, what is it now? A lot of these properties they've taken out because you can do them in CSS, and they prefer that to be done in CSS. One of the interesting things and it's being set up here by the font family. I'm just going to delete this rule set real quick. If you look at this test, let me see if I can zoom in real quick, make it a little bit easier to see. This test here and this test here are using two slightly different fonts. I've zoomed way in so you can see this and be really obvious. So always be careful about that. A lot of times you want to just say, you know what, we're going to make everything the same font. And that's what this rule here did. Is it makes it basically all the same font. Now, if you want to be careful with that, you can say text area, comma, input. You know, so that's now exactly the same font. So that's what I recommend, is using a multi-selector and then defining a rule with the font that you want. And this could be a generic one like sans serif, or it could be Tahoma, Arial, and then sans serif. So sans serif is usually Arial on PC. It's Helvetica, I think, on Macs. And those two are very, very similar fonts. There are some little differences, but very, very similar. Okay. Let's see here. Okay, your text area, if you have a value for a text area, it does not have a value field, it's going to go with what's inside the text. And the reason why is this can be very large and a huge block of text. So anything we're going to define, we really need to define it in a case like that. We're not going to define it as value. That way it can still be used by whoever needs it. This is going to be used anytime we want a larger free-forming type of feedback. If I have a comment field or something like that in my form, but even in other places, like if I'm on Facebook as an example and I see a text box of information, or if I'm posting on Twitter, even though I can only post so many characters on Twitter, it's still more than one line, so a text area will be used. And for that reason, a lot of times the text area is referred to as a multi-line text field. So where your text is a single line text field, your text area tag is a multi-line text field. And depending upon what browser you're in is what it's going to look like. Different browsers have different looks for things. That's just kind of to be expected. Now, I've put two different buttons here. One's a submit and one's a reset. Helpful if I spelled submit right. Okay. So if I can put John Paul in here, set this to green, and change the age to 21, and say resubmit. Notice that John stays, age disappeared, green disappeared, and the comment section stayed the same. Reset, submits it out. If I click submit, it goes in and does my form processor. my text area did not have a name, and so it did not look correctly. This information is all sent via post. Age had a name, it just didn't have a value, so it sent the name as a key, but no value to it. So this is a little form processor I built that you all can, practice sending data to. So if I put in 21, say submit, now age is 21. If I go in here, say please show me, and submit, there's no name associated with it, so that data is missing. Okay, so I would have to come over here, and in my text area, name equals comments. And there's my comments with the appropriate information. So that was just kind of a real simple thing, just kind of show you your text area, your input, and your reset, submit, stuff like that. Our buttons, our buttons are very, very generic. So a lot of times people will apply like a class to a button to make it really stand out. And while the reset button was pretty standard for a long time, a lot of times people put them real close to submit, and they might accidentally hit reset instead of submit, and then they'd be really frustrated and say, you know what, I don't need this. So a lot of people don't even bother with the reset button anymore. You can leave the browser window if you want. You don't have to stay here. If I just say go away like that, form's still going to work. If I click on the submit button, notice it still works just fine. It's just that you don't see it, okay? You don't see a way to reset it. The option is just refresh it. Now, the other thing I do want to mention is that with both reset and submit, they're buttons, and what's displayed on them is displayed based upon what the type is. But I can override this. I can say, for example, value equals and the value overrides the default submit. Now I can do a submit button styling without using classes, using property type and stuff. That's a little bit challenging. And because of some of those challenges, some people have decided to look for other alternatives. And one of those other alternatives is the button. And button actually has two tags, an open and close. And in between them is where our value goes. Now, by default, it looks the same, but a lot of people find it's easier to say, hey, you know what? Inside my CSS, I want to change the way a button looks. And I'm going to come in here and I'm going to specify that it's kind of a dark red. So background color is dark red. Color is going to be white, which is FFF. Font weight is going to be bold. And now you see this info as an example. And I can go further and say padding is going to be 10 pixels. Font size is going to be 20 pixels, etc. And I can kind of go in and make this start to really, really stand out. Now, I still have my default border and properties I need to change, and I can make those changes. That's easy. But a lot of people find that working with a button is a little bit easier. And a lot of times, if I click on it, notice it still takes me exactly where I want to go to submit my information. Okay, so there's a lot of things I can do with button. Um, I can create rounded corners. I can take away the border. I can, even do a faux gradient background to make it look raised or put an image behind it. So lots of stuff I can do. Now, the other main type of form field that we will see and use from time to time is the select. And the select is made up of actually two tags, the select tag and the option tag. Let's take a look at what that would look like. And I'm just going to kind of duplicate this value here, the red, green, blue. And what I would do is I'd say select, excuse me, sorry, label for favorite number. What is your favorite number? And then I come down here and say select ID equals favorite number. Now I'll specify options for these. And an option will have an optional value attribute. And this is what's actually sent. So I might pick 7. Now, option doesn't have to have a closing bracket, but it's not bad to have it. If it doesn't, what happens is it goes until it finds a new option, and that's good enough for it. So here's my favorite color, green, favorite number, call it 14. I submit my info. Notice here's favorite number 14, favorite color is green, and that works. So my select tag allows for a drop down option that's only as big as it needs to be, no bigger. I can set a default value that's submitted, or the value submitted is found as what the label part is. If I come here and choose 7, just as an example, submit the info, notice for favorite number, it puts first, not 7. But if I put 8, it shows as 8. So if there's a value set for the option, it displays the value. If there's not, it displays what the text is that was displayed on the form. And that's kind of how a select works. Now, select's got a couple of other things about it. You can do, I think it's multiple, oops. When I choose, or when I add the attribute multiple, notice there, once again, is no, I don't have to say multiple equals true, multiple equals multiple, or anything like that. Now it displays multiple lines, and it allows me to do a control click to add additional items, or I can do shift click to get a range. So if I want to say select 7, hold shift, get 14, that gets everything in between. So that gives me some other options as well for it. If I submit this, you're noticing it's only submitting 1 by default. That's kind of how it's done. We have to look more in depth of how that's working to make it truly fit us. But the other thing to notice with that is if I choose multiple, it's showing multiple lines at one time. And that's kind of a real important deal. Um, oh, okay. So, like I said, this is more commonly used if I have a lot of items, so more than 5. If I have less than 5, I'll often use just a radio button. But if I've got a lot of items, a lot of times I'll pick something like this. Now, if I were go and look at something like Bootstrap and look at their forms, there's a lot of more things that I can do with forms and that's because of the CSS framework that's working with it. It's nothing really to do with the HTML form itself. It's using the same tags, all of stuff, but it's just the classes and the way they've assigned rules and things like that to it. There's a few other things that you can do. You can do option sets to kind of group your options together. That's not real common, but it is possible. You can do a field set, which groups fields together and puts like a little border around them. And once again, it's possible, but not real common. There's some other things to do, but mostly what you're going to do is work with text boxes, select boxes, radio buttons, and check boxes. So this gives you everything that you need to know to do the basis of building a form without doing a lot of CSS involved. But you can, obviously make some pretty standard CSS things to define padding and space in your margins and stuff like that. Excuse me, to work with it. So that just kind of gives you some ideas to play with as you're working with building out a form. Whenever you build a form, you want to think about what type of information you collect. Knowing that the more information you ask for, the less likely you are to get it. So if I ask for 12 pieces of information, I can assume right off the bat that depending upon what I'm asking for and what the person's going to get in response, there's a pretty good chance that they're not going to fill that out. If there's only 2 or 3 things to fill out and they're pretty short, odds are they're going to go ahead and fill that out. So it just kind of depends upon what it is that you're doing, how you're doing it, and that type of thing. So always be mindful whenever you're creating your forms, you're going to do through that. Next week, we're going to talk, or sorry, not next week, on Thursday, we're just going to quickly talk about programming languages in web pages. So that's going to be, how do I take my form, the nuts and bolts was, how do I take my form and how do I do something with that? And I can do things on a client side with this form, or I can do things on the server side. That's going to be a very high level. We're not going to get into programming or anything like that. We're just going to talk at a high level, 20,000 foot level, looking down at forms and HTML landscape and say, okay, this is the types of things we could do. And if I want to get into programming some of these types of things, this is what I can further go in and do with it. So do keep that in mind. That we're not going to be like super detailed on Thursday, but we're just going to start talking about some of those type of things based upon what we see here. Okay. Is there any questions about forms or things that you might want to take a look at or see or try? Maybe some of the different types of the input boxes, stuff like that.
I just have a question about, not about this, I understood it, but are we gonna have like a final exam or it's gonna count it as the final project?
So you have the final project and then you have the final exam. The exam should be kind of like your last quiz.
Yeah.
So not too difficult, I don't think. And it'll only cover the stuff that is new since the last quiz. So it's not going to be a comprehensive final that covers everything. It's just covering the new material.
Perfect.
I got another question.
Sure.
When is the exam gonna be?
So the exam, if we pull this up for this class, and this is my personal take on it. So I know other people are doing different things. This is a Monday, Thursday, 2 p.m. So the exam is supposed to be Wednesday at 2 p.m. But what I'm going to do, because I know you guys are in different time zones and everything, I'm going to set up to be basically like all day Wednesday.
Okay.
That way, whatever works best for you, if you're a better morning person or better evening person, you can work around your own time zone, other exams, stuff like that. I'm going to set up all day Wednesday. That's my plan.